Hey, what's up you guys, the Curious Owl here, and today I am bringing you my April wrap-up. So April was the month of ARCs for me. I got through so many books this month. I'm so proud of myself, and the majority of them were ARCs that I had requested on NetGalley and had received and were doing reviews for. So all of the reviews that I have for the stories that I had read this month, I will leave in the description for you guys. So in April, I read a total of 15 books, which beats my record of the year so far, where in February I had read 11 books. So I am very proud of myself for how this past month has gone, even though I didn't read nearly as much as I wanted to and didn't finish nearly as many books as I wanted to this month because I had so many more ARCs that I didn't get to. I'm still proud of the work I've done, and honestly, I've gotten to a point in my life where the ARCs don't necessarily matter. Like, they matter, but my review of them is going to come when it comes. Trying to stress myself out about these ARCs and getting them done is not going to help me at all. If anything, it is going to drive me absolutely batshit insane. So my whole philosophy now has been that, you know, if I can get through an ARC, that's great, but I am not going to stress myself out about it as much, because I've done that way too often where I have tried to set up a reading schedule and have fallen behind on it and feeling stressed, and that's not conducive for me, nor is it really conducive for my reviews, because then they just feel rushed and I feel like I don't have a lot to say because I rushed through the story itself to try to finish it. So like I said, I read a total of 15 books this month, which gave me a total of 3,504 pages for the month, and I also had listened to about 2,107 minutes worth of audiobooks, which was about 35 hours and 7 minutes worth. 13 out of the 15 books that I read this month were ebooks, because the majority of them were the ARCs that I had that were sent from NetGalley, which all come as ebooks for me on my Kindle, and 2 of them were audiobooks. I read 2 audiobooks this month that I was very happy with. One of them I kind of sped through at like 2 speed because I know the story back, front, and sideways, and the other one I had honestly been super intimidated to read, so I was very excited. 13 out of the 15 were books that were sent to me from NetGalley, and 2 of them were personal copies. They were my Audible audiobooks that I had. So this past month was also the House Cupathon, which was an amazing time. Hufflepuff won, which was my team, so I'm very, very excited to say that we won the first round, and we have so much that we are going to be thinking about when it comes to the next round, which will be in November. We have a lot of ideas that are going through, but for right now, we're kind of taking a break from that because we have the Biblio games coming up in June, and a couple of us are going to be doing that, so we kind of wanted a bit of a break before we started jumping right back into getting ideas down for the next round of the House Cupathon. But I completed all of my challenges for the House Cupathon, and I was so excited. The first book I finished was the story Wreck by Kirsten Cron Mills. This is a young adult contemporary that focuses on a young woman who is about to graduate high school and unfortunately finds out that her father has been diagnosed with ALS, or what is better known as Lou Gehrig's disease. If you don't know what Lou Gehrig's disease is, it is a really awful condition that happens in a lot of older people. I would say probably like older adults, not exactly elders, but it essentially is a physical condition where the individual loses control of being able to use any of the muscles in their body. They basically become a vegetable in a way, meaning that they have no control of using their muscles. They're basically almost paralyzed in a way, and it also involves a lot of emotional outbursts that are uncontrollable because of the fact that they're essentially losing not only their physical abilities, but also their mental capacity. This basically was following the main character as she was watching her father essentially deteriorate, and I loved the story. It was incredibly unique and has not been something that I have seen at all. I don't think I've ever read a story where there's a character discussed that has this kind of a condition, and I think it's incredibly important because ALS is something that does affect several hundred thousands of people across the world, and it's something that I've noticed come up a lot more recently with different individuals, and I think it is just one of the most heartbreaking diseases, other than maybe like Alzheimer's or dementia, because Lou Gehrig's, you lose not only your mental state, but you lose the ability to even be able to live. And I gave it a 5 out of 5 stars. I absolutely loved it. It was very heartbreaking a lot of times, and I do remember crying many times throughout the story. The second book I finished this month was Weapons of Peace by Peter D. Johnson. This was actually a historical fiction novel. When I first had gotten this as an arc from NetGalley, I thought that it was going to be more of like an essay collection talking about things during World War II, but it actually was a historical fiction novel that basically focused in the arts of negotiation, which I had no idea was even a thing. So this story basically takes place during the beginnings of World War II and Hitler's regime rising to power, and it follows mostly this nurse who is a trained military individual. She was trained in fighting, and she meets a man who is an American that was sent over to try to negotiate with Hitler about several different things, and you find out a lot about his past and how he got involved with all of that. But the story is really learning about the ideas of negotiation and how to negotiate with people and how to really work with different individuals that basically have different tactics than you. So the whole story is this nurse learning about these things, and she decides to take over this man's mission because he is essentially incredibly injured to where he's not going to be able to complete his mission. So she takes it over, and it is the most amazing story, I think, in terms of a female-centered, strong female character story that kicks ass, because not only is she, you know, basically gonna revolt against Hitler's regime with this resistance group, but she's also honestly in this whole idea trying to also find her son, who was essentially kidnapped by her ex-husband, and she's trying to find a way to not only help this man that she helped heal, but then also get her son back. So it's a very interesting story and very complex, and I was really surprised with how much I enjoyed it because it felt so different. There has not been a story that I have heard of nor read that focuses so much on this idea of negotiation and the art of it. And the author Peter actually has come out with a book that talks about just the general art of negotiation. So he knows exactly what this is all about. And it honestly felt like a passion project of his to write a historically fictionalized piece in a time period that obviously had a lot of negotiation tactics rise up from it and a lot of ideas about negotiation rise from it that he wanted to focus in. So it was really, really interesting to read. The one thing I will say though is it was very slow in a lot of parts, but that's because historical fictions for me tend to be a little on the slow side because I'm really trying to wrap myself into the time period and understand, you know, what might be fact versus fiction, and I just found some points of it to be a little on the slow side, but I ended up giving it a 4 out of 5 stars, and I highly recommend it for those of you that are interested in World War II, because I think you would definitely enjoy it and really get to see a whole other side of the entire war, I think, if you're really into that. The next book I read was Broadland by David Blake. This is I would consider more of an adult mystery, but it didn't feel like it. I gave this a 3 out of 5 stars, and the thing was the story itself was really cool. The crime that had happened and the mystery that was involved with the story was really interesting. It was placed in a small English area, like a little harbor area, and the main detective was really interesting. But the thing was there wasn't really a lot of character growth. There wasn't really a lot of roundness with the characters. There just wasn't a lot to do with them. The story focused more on the case, which was okay because I liked when stories focus on cases, but I wanted to know more about the characters because they all had very interesting stories that I wanted to know more about, and I felt like the story was too quick for what I wanted because there was no ability to learn about these characters, and it just felt kind of flat for me. The fourth book I finished this month was Unbroken by Brooklyn Ray. This is a new adult paranormal romance story featuring male-male romance between a young man who has moved to a town called Port Louis, which is essentially thought to be run by witches, and the house that he is living in with his sister and a friend of theirs is essentially haunted by a demon, and he very quickly in the story, at the very beginning of it, starts having a seriously sexual relationship with that demon. The whole story is basically that. It's basically just a lot of sex scenes with him and this demon, but the story does delve a lot into this poor young man's life and how he's been very traumatized throughout his life in past relationships and has a very hard time opening up to people. And this is a lot of, I think, exploration on his part and understanding that, you know, even though he dealt with a lot of crap in his past, there is still someone who is out there wanting to really take care of him. And I think it's a lot of more focus on that. There are some focuses in some of the more paranormal aspects, but not really until towards the end of the novel. The majority of the story, though, focuses on the main character's inability to really open himself up to this demon and really just dealing with a lot of his past and trying to move past it, but having a very hard time with because his past is so traumatic. I ended up giving it a 4 out of 5 stars because I liked the story a lot, but I felt like I wanted more of the paranormal ideas. I wanted more of the paranormal things that came up at the end of the story, and I didn't feel like I got very much of it. And I kind of wanted the story to continue because there's something that happens at the end of the story that basically sends off the two characters on this adventure, and I wanted to know how it went, but I didn't get that, and I was kind of upset. The next book I finished was Amazing Grace by Kim Nash. This is an adult contemporary, and I loved this book so much. It was one of my favorites from the entire month. This focuses on a single mother who essentially is newly divorced and is trying to just live her life, but it's very hard considering that her divorce was kind of messy, and she is really just more concerned about her kid than she is herself. And the whole story is her meeting this man who is her gardener and kind of building a relationship with him, but she's very scared to do so because of the fact that she cares so much about her son and she cares so much about his things, and she's also very stuck in the past of her relationship with her ex-husband that it makes it very hard for her to move on. But the whole story is about her learning how to move past all of that and really find love within herself, because she hates a lot of things about herself because of the fact that her ex-husband left her, and feels like that that she was a huge part of the reason he left. And so a lot of the story is more focused in her self-development and self-growth before really diving into a relationship and then blossoming in this relationship because she has found love within herself. And I found it so empowering and so sweet. And yes, it was more of a rom-com story, but I loved it. I couldn't help it. It felt more grounded in reality than a lot of rom-com stories are, which I think is a huge plus, because rom-com stories for me are very hard to get into because they just don't feel real, and this one did, and I was really impressed by it. The next book I read was The Dodo Knight by Michelle Renee. This is another historical fiction book, and this actually deals with the relationship between who we know as Lewis Carroll, the author of Alice in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass, and the young girl who essentially was the muse for those stories. Michelle basically takes some liberties with understanding the story of these two and how they met. There are some things that are definitely fictionalized for the benefit of the story, but a lot of the story is based in the fact that Lewis Carroll and the little girl that became Alice were somehow connected. He had known her parents, and Lewis had a very strange affinity for children. He wasn't necessarily a pedophile, but he had a better connection with children than he did with adults. The story basically just follows his entire relationship with Alice and creating the story of Alice in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass, and basically how she might have viewed him as a young child and having been the muse for this story. The next book I read was The Rules of Berk by Tracy Finlay, which was another one of my most favorite books of this month. I loved it. This is a story placed in Cadillac, Michigan, where this young woman and her brother live in their childhood home, and they had this game growing up called Birkin. It is essentially a version of hide and seek, but it's a little bit more on the violent side with that, because it never involves you taking turns being the person that is it. It is always that this young girl is the one being chased, and her brother is it. And they have 3 rounds of it, and basically after the 3rd round, they're supposed to, beat the crap out of each other. But here's the thing, is that one time when they play, when they're a lot older, for nostalgia purposes, according to the brother, He actually threatens to kill her, and she has to run off and protect herself because her brother is now chasing her for some unknown reason. But the story focuses on really understanding the past of these siblings, because their father had gone to jail at one point for supposedly murdering this main character's friend, and their mother had just up and left them when they were very young. And so the story is really understanding their relationship and their past to understand why it is now that this brother is trying to kill her. And it is very dark. It is very, very hard to get through it sometimes because of how dark it is, but it is so interesting. It is a psychological thriller that is unlike any other for me, because it, I think, honestly just kept me on the edge of my seat so much that I had to step away from it a few times because I was getting a little bit of a panic attack sometimes trying to read this book, because I was just so scared for this character, and it really felt like I was in there with her and trying to really just move away from this guy because he was incredibly dangerous. The next book I read was The Time of Our Lives by Portia McIntosh. This is another adult contemporary, and this focuses on a woman who essentially for the first time in about 10 years is meeting up with her friends for one of her friends' wedding. And the thing is that she doesn't really feel like she is meeting up with everyone else's expectations, because at this point at nearly 30, she is not in a relationship at all, doesn't have any kids, hates the job that she has, and feels like she's never going to go anywhere. The night before the wedding, though, she meets this man who is essentially somebody within the friend group of the couple that is getting married, and she starts to think that maybe he might have some interesting qualities about him, and she'd like to get to know him better. But then after being roped into being an emergency bridesmaid for this wedding due to the fact that one of the bridesmaids goes into labor, she realizes that the best man of this wedding is a guy that she used to have a crush on 10 years before, who kind of broke her heart. And the story is really learning about their past and understanding kind of where she wants to go from now, because now that she's seen this guy for the first time in 10 years, she's starting to question a lot of things about what she wants now in life based on what she has learned from her past. It's a very, very sweet story. I really enjoyed it. Another one of those rom-com stories that I think is more based in reality than anything else. But the one thing I will say that's not really realistic is that a lot of the story happens over the course of one night. I don't think that would really happen over the course of one night, but it was still too enjoyable for me to really be mad about that. The next story I read is I Know You by Eric Thurm. This is a new adult, I would say, thriller where this woman is basically trying to find her little sister because her little sister's been kidnapped, but she doesn't know by who, doesn't know why, but knows it has something to do with her younger brother. And so essentially they are trying to find out what exactly happened and trying to find her before she is possibly killed. This one was okay. I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars because I did like it, but I didn't feel like I really got that attached to any of the characters. I felt like it was just more focused in the chase, which was fine, but I didn't really feel like I gave a crap about anything. I felt like I didn't give a crap about the main character. I didn't feel like I gave a crap about the sister. Like, just for some reason, the story didn't grab me emotionally as much as I wanted to, but the construction of the story was actually really good, and the twists were actually really interesting, and when you find out who exactly had kidnapped the sister and why, it definitely kept me, like, threw me for a loop, and I was really impressed by that. The next book I read was Pretending in Paradise by M. Ulrich. This is another adult contemporary with the dislike to love trope and the fake relationship tropes, which I think works so well together, and I loved this. If you guys are familiar with rom-coms, the best way I can compare this to a movie is The Proposal by Sandra Bullock and Ryan Reynolds. It is basically the same thing in a way, and I loved it. It was so good. The Proposal is actually one of the rom-com movies I actually like, and I don't like a lot of rom-com movies, but this one was really good, and Pretending in Paradise was just as good because it focuses on two women who work together, and one of them is a travel writer who gets herself into some legal trouble, and then the other woman, a PR lady who is new to this company and trying to save the company a little bit, saving face for them, has to go on this trip with this travel writer to a resort that is couples only. And the reason she has to go is because it is couples only, but it is a new resort that this travel writer really wants to get into. And so they have to go there and pose as a couple in order to actually be able to review this place. But the PR lady is also trying to make sure that the travel writer doesn't do anything more stupid than she's already done. So they're really just trying to learn about each other, and there's some really hard-hitting moments within the story about the PR lady that comes up that are very, very relatable to me specifically. So I found so much enjoyment through this story, and it was so cute. All the rom-com books that I have read this month have made me very happy. I don't know why. They all just actually feel like stuff that I enjoyed, which is very weird considering I don't like rom-coms, but I'm not gonna complain. I'm happy with how the rom-coms have come out this month. I'm very excited to see that more actually do well, because a lot of them just feel fake, and I'm really happy to see that these ones didn't. The next book I read was another adult contemporary called Recipe for Love by Aurora Ray. This one was honestly very unique. I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars because just some parts of it I didn't necessarily care for, and I didn't feel as much of a connection, I think, emotionally to the story, but it was still very good. And it focuses on this chef who moves to this very small town in upstate New York and essentially works for this restaurant that is now reopening, and she goes to meet off one of the farmers that are basically giving ingredients to this restaurant. It's a very farm-to-table restaurant, and she meets one of the farmers, who is this woman named Hannah, and basically they start a little bit of a flirtationship, and the relationship grows, and you see that. And both of them really just have a very interesting dynamic. I really like the story a lot, I think, for the relationship build, because I think it was very easy to see that these two had a very instant attraction, but it didn't feel like insta-love, and I felt like the relationship bloomed in a way that made sense. But for some reason, I just didn't have as much of an emotional connection to it, I think, as I did with Pretending in Paradise, and that's okay, but I still really loved the story. I loved how there were a lot of things about the culinary world and the farming world that I didn't really know much about that I learned through the story, and it was really interesting to read, because those are two things I don't think are talked about a lot within any book, are anything to do with being a chef and anything to do with being a farmer. It was interesting. The next book I read was a short story collection called Survivor's Guilt and Other Stories by Greg Harry. This was a collection of crime and mystery stories, but I gave it a 3 out of 5 stars because the weird thing was I went into this thinking that it was going to be a lot of stories about survivor's guilt specifically, and talking about people that had dealt with different scenarios of abuse or significantly awful events that had happened in their lives. And that was true for the most part. But a lot of the stories I felt like were very confusing because something about them didn't make sense, or I didn't understand where the survivor's guilt ideas came in for them. And I think that was partially on my end because I had expected all these stories to be about survivor's guilt, which I would say about 60% of them were. But the rest of them just didn't really jive with that theme, and I think I was just a little confused about that. So it was a good collection though. They were all very interesting crime and suspense stories that were definitely really cool and well done for short stories. And I don't know, just something about it didn't sit well with me. The next book I read was another short story collection, which was called Swords, Sorcery, and Self-Rescuing Damsels, edited by Lee French and somebody else, I can't remember her name, but the thing is right here anyway. But this is a short story collection dealing with fantasy stories that focus with strong female characters, and I loved it. It was so good. I really like this collection a lot. I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars. The only thing I will say is that a couple of the stories felt a little slow, and honestly, they were all so good that I wanted them to be longer pieces. I was so upset that they were short stories because I wanted them to be longer. There were so many good stories that I would have liked to have seen be continued into like a full-on novel or series, and I was sad. I wanted them to be bigger pieces. The next book I read was the first audiobook I finished for the month, which was A Clash of Kings by George R.R. Martin. I finally finished A Clash of Kings, and it only took me like almost 2 full months, but I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars, and the thing was that I feel like with this one specifically, and I talked about this a little bit in my vlogs for the House Cupathon, is that this book is in the middle of so much. A Game of Thrones was a lot easier to get into because it was the beginning of this entire story, but A Clash of Kings is so focused in all the battles that are going on and the war that is ravaging Westeros right now that a lot of the things that were happening within the story were a little confusing, because you have like 6 different people, 6 different clans of individuals that are fighting for the Iron Throne, and you have a hard time with understanding, you know, who is with who. And then one of the perspectives, Theon, I didn't understand why he was even a part of the story until much later, and I just didn't see a point to him until like the end of the book when things happened, and I just, this one just wasn't as enjoyable for me, only because of the fact that I felt like I was just very lost throughout the story in many places, but overall was still very interesting. There were some very interesting things that developed for several different characters, like Arya and Sansa and Jon and Tyrion and Daenerys, but Davos and Theon, I didn't quite understand why they were there. Still don't, but not gonna complain too much because they actually had some pretty interesting scenes happen, so I don't know. And finally, the last book I finished for April. I'm sorry this is such a long video, but the last book I finished in April was a reread of Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. I reread the audiobook at the very end of April, like within the last 2 days, and because I know this story front, back, and sideways, I put the audiobook on 2-speed and finished it before the end of the day on the 30th, but then I forgot to put in the challenges points for that in Hufflepuff's house points counter, but we won anyway, so it wasn't that big of a deal. But yeah, I reread this for now the second time on audiobook, probably like the 4th or 5th time in just reading the book in general, and it was still so enjoyable. But anyway, oh my gosh, that is like the end finally of this wrap up. I'm so sorry that it's so long, but I'm so proud of myself for getting through 15 books this month. I'm so proud of all the work I did this month to get through a lot of arcs that I had. I still have a crap ton that I have to read in May, and I doubt I'm gonna get through all of them, but I am going to try to get through as much as I can. So anyway, let me know what you guys read in April down in the comments below if you would like to share, and otherwise, if you guys did enjoy this video, please do give it a big thumbs up, and if you're not already and you'd like to be, hit the button down below and subscribe to become an owlet in our flock, and I will see all of you guys in my next video. Bye guys!